On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Chris Ieva. He is the head of data science at Anheuser-Busch. This episode is going to be really interesting because Chris has a very unique background coming from the Marine Corps, from the military background, making a transition into industry and into the data space. And really what we want to talk to him about on this episode is some of those transferable skills, and hopefully helps the audience, some people who are veterans, people looking to leave the military and transition, and understanding how potentially they can leverage some of his insights and experiences. And Chris, I'm super excited to do this episode. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for all your listeners. I'm excited to do this. This is awesome.
Absolutely. So I guess just for context, head of data science, Anheuser-Busch, I think we'll kind of leave it at that for this episode. You had a very lengthy career in the Marines. And obviously for the last several years, half a decade plus, 6-7 years, you've been in the data science world. Talk to us a little bit about, obviously, your role in the Marine Corps, and we'll kind of start from there.
Yeah, sure. So I am a retired Marine Corps officer. I'm very proud of my service. I'm proud of those who served with me. And thanks for everyone's support. I think veterans are definitely supported. I definitely think there's a lot for veterans to offer. It's a unique community. It's a unique time that, you may have someone who has served 20 years and, theoretically our nation's been at war that whole time. So I think this is a unique generation that's now probably entering the private sector in an increasing amount.
Absolutely. And obviously there's no higher accolade for someone who's served, and you put 20 years of your time in providing everyone's freedom, and no amount of thanks could ever be bestowed on you. So thank you for your service. And when you're looking at your career, and you've made a great transition, you're the head of data science at Anheuser-Busch, you've taken the right steps. I think you made a comment when we were talking about this subject a while back about how do you translate those skills, right? And sometimes it's difficult for people to actually look at some of the intangibles and look at some of what they fundamentally did, because maybe the nomenclature is different. Maybe the recruiting world doesn't understand it. There's some gaps there to help someone who's leaving a military service to find that first job.
It's a challenge, and you'll hear that all the time, how to translate your resume. There's other translations, like everything from behavior, speech, approach. It is a challenge. I think it's also sometimes a little bit hard on the veteran from a pride perspective. If you led a unit of 30 Marines, it's hard when you're asked a direct report question, what's the largest, and, how do I answer that? How do I approach that? How do I convey my responsibility? Or if you had indirect responsibility or other things. So it's a constant translation game. And I think what I've sort of learned is, and as I keep going in the private sector, it becomes easier after time. And there's some hurdles everyone, but you consume a lot of your sort of brain processing power on doing that translation, whether it's in an interview, whether it's in a resume. I don't think it happens organically. I think you really have to work on it, and it takes time to really get it right. And there's people who can help out there and help do that translation and provide really good pointers, but it is a challenge.
I'd imagine, I have never served, so I'm just hypothesizing this, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But I envision the Marine Corps is a much more structured environment to anything I do day to day. I can't imagine, it's as rigorous a structure as what you had to do for 20 years. What's that experience like when you're leaving that type of environment where there is defined processes, there's chains of command, there are things and, rituals and activities and that structure, and you're coming to the private world where, yes, there's rules, but I'd imagine it's not the same level as the military.
It is a different. Sometimes I like sharing anecdotes, so maybe they could be helpful. First of all, I've been very fortunate that the Marine Corps, I was selected, attended the Naval Academy. I attended a whole bunch of training in the Marine Corps. Some of it was, how to become an infantry officer. I also did a tour as an intelligence officer. So I was trained in sort of, how do you do analytics, right? It wasn't data science. It wasn't this. It was approaches. Some of it's philosophical. But how do you collect on someone who doesn't want to be collected? How do you tie that into actual decisions? So there's all this sort of informal training. But The time it really hit me is I went and I used an executive MBA at NYU Stern to really be my transition mechanism, a network, a skill set, language. And we were in a class in leadership, and a couple of my buddies were like, "Hey, man, doesn't this class suck? It must be weird." And I said, "No, I'm learning a lot." And one of the topics was, how do you lead an organization when it's going bankrupt, right? Because the theme was you may be able to take a higher role if you were going in a company that isn't successful and be the turnaround agent, the turnaround guy or girl. And I found it fascinating because in the Marines, not being part of the team or quitting the team is just not negotiable. Not doing the mission is just not heard of. Like you may have a cost. That cost could be risk to force, but you're always going to get the job done. Like that's unquestionable. And for me, it was weird to hear that, wait a minute, if a company's not doing well, my team members could leave me. And then by the same token, how do you lead when you don't have those? How do you build that confidence? How do you inspire? So I found that interesting because it sort of changed some things. The other thing I sort of realized is in the Marine Corps, there's still going to be politics. There's going to be informal rules. There's going to be other things. I would say everyone is very technically competent. They are well trained, well prepared for the roles across it. And they rely on performance to really articulate their value to the organization. And in the end, they're committed to the higher good. I found that sort of difficult to navigate in the private sector, that there may be different agendas by different folks, and there's different levels of, when I say technical, it's not data, it's just whatever your job function is. That to me is still sort of a little bit of a mystery. I have a buddy who I went to the Naval Academy with, and he got out at the 10-year mark, and he says, probably around 8 years after he left, he was an aviator. He finally felt comfortable with that, of when it's okay to take credit, when it's not, when to contribute to the team, when to back off. I'm probably still in the learning stages of that.
That's interesting. As you're talking through that, I'm reflecting, and everyone has, if you're in a corporate environment, you have your own self-interest. You do have the interest of the company, but obviously you're there to progress your life, your career. And that's probably very foreign given, in a military role, you guys are all working towards one as a collective unit, because obviously lives are at stake. Like if somebody decides, well, this is not, I have a self-interest in my own, benefit or whatnot, then obviously that could disrupt the sensitivity, and the cost of that could be immense.
So there's something called like a tick or troops in contact. So if you're the quote unquote on scene commander and like you get into a fight, you can declare a tick. And essentially what will happen is that'll be a signal that, hey, we need to allocate more aviation. We may have to get, intelligence assets on station. It's going to cue a lot of signals. So like after you experience combat a lot, you don't want to declare a tick if you can manage it, because I don't want to take resources from someone I don't know. Like if I'm out in Western Iraq in Anbar province, I may be taking a fixed wing aviation capability or a intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance asset from someone who needs it in Baghdad. And it's some way separated. I'll never know that. Like you'll never know. But you work under that understanding that even though you're in a life and death situation, do I declare a tick which will get me assets? Because I don't want to take away from others. And I've used that example to explain to like my family or other things, the sort of the mindset of, when to do that, when not to, what's the maturity, because we don't have an infinite amount of time, infinite amount of resources to solve a problem. And we have to fair share the resources where they're best. To me, that's like the most poignant way to explain that you could be in a firefight and not declare a tick and not take away assets because of someone you don't know may need it. But then again, if you need it, let's declare it and let's win that gunfight.
Amazing. You mentioned, and obviously that's probably foreign unless you've served in combat or you've been in the military to understand the preciousness of that resource, because it is a life or death matter potentially for the person making that split second or that in moment decision. And I think that something you mentioned that stuck with me on our pre-call was you said lives matter based on accuracy and precision. The enormity of that statement and kind of translating skills from the military service to the private sector, that's a big step in of itself, because obviously the mindset, I mean, not that anybody's doing again in their job doesn't matter, it doesn't make an impact.
Sure.
But there's a different level that you're kind of dealing with in the Marine Corps.
I would say so. As an infantry officer, like location and distance and geometries and other things. We can just call that like situational awareness. So I think that's like always ingrained on you. And some of the training, you're always set up to pass, but some of the training is built in with unknowns to replicate combat. So if you're told that you have to march 6 miles under a certain time with a certain load, that's tough. When you don't know the distance you have to go, what speed you should march, what load you should bring, how you should do it, that's reality. And then to have a pass or fail standard based upon that, that's where it comes down that if I run too fast, what happens if it was really a 10-mile course and I just burnt myself out? So like information and actionable information and sharing that if you would look at like an information pyramid or hierarchy, we would want wisdom at the top when you make a decision. And that's something that we always value. And it's reinforced that the cost of failure is lives, is mission, and it's non-negotiable. And you just can't pick up that habit overnight. So it's just sort of different. Like if I exit a subway station, I'm immediately trying to figure out which direction is cardinal north, which the street looks like. That's ingrained. And I'm sure there's other veterans who have the same experience, or maybe you're an aviator or done something differently. You're just going to treat information a lot different.
I mean, as well, you mentioned obviously well trained. And again, curious to see kind of your view of transitioning. So obviously you take a job, you've developed some skills. I know you mentioned an MBA program, you're picking up more skills to help with the transition. When you're looking at the level of training, obviously, there's a significant amount of resources for someone in the military to train to do one particular thing. And then obviously you go into a job post-military career and you're getting training. Is there an adjustment to understanding, okay, well, I'm being given some of the tools. I'm gonna have to go do a lot of self-learning. I've got to go ask a lot of questions. Whereas before it was like, to do this job, here's what you have to do. Is that part of the transition to understand that, training is going to be a little bit more self-directed potentially?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a little bit different. I think without a doubt, to your earlier point, when you take a role in the military, you're extremely well trained. So my first job is as a platoon commander. I had attended a 6-month basic officer course, which all Marine officers do, whether you're a lawyer or anything else. And then you go to a follow-on school to learn your military occupational specialty. So another 3 months in infantry officer course, which is a little bit of a gut check. So when you think about it, if I went to a service academy for 4 years and then 9 months of follow-on training for your first job, the first time you step in front of an employee, if you will, you're extraordinarily well prepared. In the private sector, I think it's a little bit different. There's a balance between training and education. I actually think in many ways you're overtrained. Sometimes you're hesitant to talk about those experiences, or sometimes you can't even understand the lineage of how you understood something. So as an infantry officer, I have to understand supply chain. I have to understand logistics. I'm not a logistics professional, but I may have a deeper understanding of that than maybe your average person. So all of a sudden, if something is being brought up about logistics or distribution, you have an insight, you have that feel, and you want to contribute, but you don't want to necessarily have to qualify it with, hey, we're an expeditionary force and we plan logistics and we can't fight without logistics. And that's how I know this. Or I've gone firm in Iraq and I put a company in a village and I have to support myself for 3 weeks, everything from power, food, ammo to civic functions. You're not able to articulate that in 20 seconds or less. So I feel there's definitely a challenge, but there's also like this undercurrent that you have a world of experience and you may not always be apt to share it, or you become frustrated because why won't they understand that I understand this? Or I had that experience in a very, I drank from a fire hose on it. So I hope I covered the question. I know I danced around it a lot, but it's an issue, right? Clearly.
That's interesting. I mean, it's just, obviously the translation of, no, it's not overtraining, but training to a different level is necessary. Again, lives matter in some of the roles in the military. So you're going to have that in certain times. And I could see the transition also, as you mentioned. I guess just from your standpoint, I always like actionable items, but if you were kind of looking at your career and just from your standpoint, are there one or two things that if someone's looking to make the transition, their career in the service is ending soon, that they should be thinking about ahead of time to kind of prepare them? Or what is it that you learned from that transition that could possibly help?
I think probably two perspectives. One is like geography, function, and industry. just trying to understand the implications of, those three decisions. That I retired from Stuttgart, Germany. So, not only did I have to move back to the USA, I had to pick where I was going to move back to the USA. Chose Princeton, New Jersey. My family and I, we chose Princeton, New Jersey for a lot of reasons. But by that choice, by geography, there's certain, implications. So in terms of industry and function, Princeton itself is awesome for a work or a follow-on career. Obviously, you're halfway between Philly and New York, so there's a lot of opportunity. But there's also cost, right? There's a higher cost of living, whether it's a home. So understanding that triad, I think, is an important first step. I think the second is developing a new network. You just spent 20 plus years, and the girls and guys who are most influential in that network may not be influential in the second half of your career in the private sector. So maybe it's a friend from high school, a friend who got out. What I found out was I was reconnecting with people 15, 10 years previous, and they were invaluable. And then I think having like a transition mechanism, for me, it was going to grad school, and I used the GI Bill, and fortunate to do so. Many veterans will tend to, there's an allowance that you could give your GI Bill to a spouse or your dependents, and they're hesitant to use it on themselves because they want to pay for college for their kids. I think that's a tough choice, but it's almost been conditioned because you don't make the most amount of money in the military. Hey, I'm going to give that to my kids or something like that. I chose to use it for myself and use the increase in my current income to support my kids for college. They're in high school now. But I think those three issues are the most important of, those three pieces of geography, industry, function. What's your network? Your network's probably different. And then the third piece of what are you going to use as a transition mechanism? For me, it was graduate school paid by the post 9/11 GI Bill.
That's awesome. I think that's some great advice. I mean, I hadn't really thought about the fact that the network completely changes and, the people that you would necessarily need for the next job are people that you've not come in contact with. Because obviously, your focus isn't to be on LinkedIn and network. Your focus isn't on those other aspects. And I could imagine those are all going to be new things that you have to pick up and translate your skill that you've picked up in the military and, position it so that somebody like me, who, another recruiter or another, a business person might understand and be able to translate that to how you could do in a job.
Yeah, totally. And, I would recommend in the most like honest and like, again, the most thoughtful way of why you have a network as you plan to transition your network, ask questions. Most people, like how thoughtful you were at the beginning of this episode. Even strangers are extremely helpful for veterans, but often you may not take the time, or you may have done it late, or you may not have taken in enough opinions or different perspectives. So to me, that network is almost like a time capsule. You need to go back and find the people who are in the private sector, or even just figuring out the place to live. What school do you send? Your kids are starting in a new school system or something like that, that now you're out of the military, and that military network won't be there forever.
That's amazing advice. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on and sharing because I think it's super relevant. I know, as a recruiter, you see a resume, it's already difficult enough to sometimes translate it. And sometimes, you're trying to do your best translating the different backgrounds. And I think when it comes to, people looking at different backgrounds, diversity in the workforce, I think part of it is looking at the intangible somebody brings and kind of being open to learning more, right? What doesn't jump off on, a resume isn't always a limitation. Maybe digging a little bit more, understanding, because obviously a lot of people come from the military. That's a lot of people entering the workforce that could be aligned to different roles that maybe we're just not aware of.
I totally believe that. And I know we talked about this in the pre-call about the private sector, and hopefully I can help and others can help who are committed to veterans, is you should view the military as like a talent pipeline. And even if it's just a little bit self-serving, someone in the military knows what date they're getting out. Sometimes they know it by the hour. Sometimes they know it by the year. But like you could look as a company and say, man, I really need a Mandarin Chinese speaker who's really good at being an analyst. And, I'm a bank here, or I'm looking to do something. So I'm in the financial services industry. I need an analyst who speaks Mandarin Chinese. The military has codes for you on these type of skill sets. And there's some girl or guy out there who wants to get out, You have to leave some time, whether it's as a retiree or you completed your first enlistment. And you could now dial up the perfect person for the job, both by qualification and time, that you could reach out and say, hey, can we make peanut butter meat chocolate here, and have the hire at the right time? And that may or may not involve a college degree. Because again, an average recruiter may think, oh, Mandarin Chinese, I have to find someone who majored in Chinese cultural studies. The military will produce a linguist, a trained linguist, not only with language capabilities, but linguistic and translator skills. And they may have been an analyst. So these are like opportunities that I think everyone could do a better job of, instead of viewing it as like, how do I help a veteran? I think you view it as a talent pipeline and get the right talent. And then it would just be translating those specific sort of codes and potential. And the military has something called terminal leave. So if you have days of vacation saved up, you could actually start working for a company ahead of time. You're allowed to have like one last move. So you can actually even have the military not pay for the relocation, but would be included in the relocation. So there's many incentives that are win-win. And plus I mentioned the GI Bill, that if you have a former service member, they may have access to the GI Bill. They may be involved in reserves or the National Guard, which is continual education. You could actually hire someone at the entry level, and they're naturally going to have the means, the attitude, and the mindset to develop. And they, like I said, they may be in the reserve. So you may have this Mandarin Chinese analyst who once a month goes and gets training to help the country or help their state, their National Guard, and they're adding more skill sets back to your primary duties. It's a shame that it's not really viewed and used that way. Or there's like here in Manhattan, there's like the service member who undergrad went to Harvard, got out after 4 years, and then received an MBA from Wharton. That's an easy veteran decision to make. The harder one is finding those intangible skills and pulling them in at the right place and time.
Absolutely. I know, obviously, we're not going to change the world with this episode, but I'm hoping, people will listen to this episode and people will start to look at this as an avenue. You mentioned talent pipeline and highly skilled, highly intellectual people coming from the military, from service, that probably can do a lot more. And I think sometimes, for somebody who's never had the experience, and I can only speak for myself here, is trying to translate it is difficult. And I think, maybe we can't change all, the people in recruiting, but hopefully if somebody's in service or is looking to make the transition, maybe just understanding, what they have to do ahead of time to overcome some of the hurdles, unfortunately, might be a great outcome. And, thank you for sharing, because I think this is, to me, a super valuable topic. I hope people reach out to you because you've made a great transition, and it's a model for other people to look at.
The one thing, as I finished up, I just want to add is what's really also being looked at now is there's a lot of military families who, both spouses and dependents, the children, they've made a lot of sacrifice. And I know there's also a lot of hidden talent there.
Mm-hmm.
So, someone may have been a attorney, but because of the military moves, it's just really hard to start a practice. Or there may be a nurse who wasn't able to get the right certifications because of demands, or there was a deployment. So I also think there's also like this hidden talent pool with a lot of military families that also have made sacrifices, but have like this awesome talent, and they're at a point where they want to use it and their military is behind them. And I know a lot of companies are recognizing that. How do we reach out and make sure that the entire military family is sort of, and again, it should be value-based. It should be a pure talent thing. Is that how do we get that talent pipeline in to our company? Because there's this attorney who's been moving around for 10 years who's super smart, and they weren't able to practice their main, but they're ready to do it now. And they have amazing potential.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll include your LinkedIn in the show notes. So if anyone's listening and from either side, if you're making the transition or you're a recruiter, you have more questions, or a hiring manager that has questions of how to look for people coming with military background, reach out to Chris. I think he can be an excellent resource. Sorry I volunteered you, but I think you'd be okay with that.
Happy to do it. Yeah, happy to do it. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for being on and sharing. Fantastic episode, fantastic information. I can't thank you enough.
I can't thank you. This is a great venue, and go Navy, beat Army. I had to put it in there, but no, I think this is a great opportunity. I think there's a lot of veterans who can contribute, and I'm very eager to see how this generation plays out, both in leadership roles as captains of industry and also involved in their community. So I'm very proud of my service and the service of other veterans, both from yesteryears and this generation and also future generations.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. We'll end on that note. And thanks for everyone for listening. I hope you guys got a lot of value out of this episode. I always ask for two things. One is, tell people about the podcast. Hopefully, we're providing some content and it's useful to you. And leave a review wherever you're listening to this. We love the feedback. And if there's other stuff you want me to talk about, please let me know. Message me on LinkedIn. I try to find guests to be able to speak to the subject. And until next time, thanks.